Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, the director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our fall humanities lecture. I want to thank Dominique Francesca, the business manager for the Center for Humanities, and Joe Fort, the director of the Athenaeum, for their work in organizing this event. And I want to remind our audience that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. So you can send us your comments and questions anytime during the talk using that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And then at the end of the talk, we'll be happy to take those questions and direct them to our speaker. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Oludamini Ogunnaike. Dr. Ogunnaike is an assistant professor of African religious thought and democracy at the University of Virginia, and he specializes in the intellectual and aesthetic dimensions of West African Sufism and Yoruba Orisha traditions. He received his PhD in African and African American Studies and Religion at Harvard University, and his AB in African Studies and Cognitive Neuroscience from Harvard College. He's the author of Poetry in Praise of Prophetic Perfection, a study of West African Mahdi poetry and its precedents. It was published in 2020, and Deep Knowledge, Ways of Knowing, and Sufism and Ifa, two West African intellectual traditions, published by Penn State University Press, that also appeared in 2020. He's working currently on two new book projects. One of those is entitled Introducing Africana Philosophy, that's under contract with Equinox Press, and also The Sage of the Sokoto Caliphate, Sheikh Danatafa, Islamic Philosophy and Sufism in West Africa. He joins us today to give our humanities lecture on the Black Light, Black Radical Traditions Beyond the Refraction of the Secular and Religious, Fanon, Wynter, and Sufi and Orisha Traditions in Dialogue. So please join me in welcoming Oludamini Ogunnaike.
Thank you very much, Professor Johnson. Thank you very much to the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities for hosting me generously in these difficult times with all of these variants coming out. I really appreciate your flexibility, and thank you all for joining us on an afternoon at a very busy end of this semester. So I'd like to share my screen now to begin the talk. All right, let's see. Okay, there we go. Can we see? All right, so as Professor Johnson said, I had the rather unwieldy title of The Black Light, Black Radical Traditions Beyond the Refraction of the Secular Religious. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about Fanon and Wynter and the Orisha and Sufi traditions. And anyone who's read any Sylvia Wynter knows she likes guide quotes or epigrams. I also love them too. So these are three epigrams that I have to kind of guide us through the talk. First is from Fanon's Damné de la Terre, Wretched of the Earth. Now the fellah, the unemployed man, the starving native, do not lay claim to the truth. They do not say that they represent the truth, for they are the truth. The next comes from my interviews with Babalawo in Nigeria, with one Babalawo Awagbola, priest of Ifa. He says, truth is the Iwa, the character or being of Oludamini, the supreme being or the ground of all being. Truth is more than saying the truth, it is being true. And the third quote comes from Cherno Bokar, Tijani Sufi, Malian Tijani Sufi of the early 20th century, who said that the light of truth is a darkness more brilliant than all other lights combined. And this talk will really be an exploration of what these statements have to do with each other, where they converge and where they diverge, and why that matters. All right, so first I'd like to go through the origins of this talk, of these ideas. Then I'd briefly like to discuss Sylvia Wynter's theory of man versus human others. Then start to complicate this by looking at the paradox of the role that Africa plays in Wynter's thought and writing. Then present a critique of Wynter's schema from Africana traditions, particularly the Afro-Atlantic Orisha traditions and Sufi traditions. And finally, we'll conclude. Oh dear. All right, there we go. All right, so this talk emerged out of reading I started doing really at the end of high school and the beginning of my undergraduate career. My undergrad degree, I started out in neuroscience, but I picked up, I had started reading Fanon a bit in high school and picked up some more Fanon at the bookstore and just couldn't put it down. But meanwhile, while I was reading Fanon and then later Césaire and later in grad school, Wynter, I was also studying Sufism and Yoruba Orisha traditions. And so I was reading all of these different figures. So here we have a whole kind of constellation of North African, Saharan, Sub-Saharan African Sufi figures who I was reading: Ibn Arabi, Sheikh Ahmed Tijani, Emir Abdul Qadir, the Jazairi, the hero of Algerian resistance against the French, Sheikh Hamallah of Mali, Sheikh Amadou Bamba of Senegal, Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, also of Senegal, Sheikh Amadou Hampâté Bâ of Mali, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Alawi of Algeria. And we have some of the founders of the traditions of Santeria and Candomblé, Mama Lola, the famous Mambo Vaudouisante, Iya Rodney, a Shango priestess from Trinidad, and Yemi Elebuibon of Nigeria, a Babalawo priest of Ifa. So I was reading about all of these people, reading the works of these people in translation while I was reading Césaire and Fanon, and then later Wynter and Cedric Robinson. And I started noticing all of these parallels between the things that they were saying. So I'd read something Fanon wrote and say, oh man, that sounds a lot like what Sheikh Ahmed Tijani or what Ibn Arabi said. I'd read something Césaire wrote and said, oh, that sounds a lot like Ibn Arabi. Just to give you some examples of this. So Césaire, two of my favorite quotes of his, it says, there are two paths to doom: by segregation, by walling yourself up in a particular, by dilution, by thinning off into the emptiness of the universal. But I have a different idea of the universal. It's of a universal rich with all that is particular, rich with all the particulars there are, the deepening of each particular, the coexistence of them all. And then he connects this to the human being, writing that within us all the ages of mankind, within us all humankind, within us animal, vegetable, mineral, mankind is not only mankind, it is universe. And this was struck me as being strikingly similar to things that I read in Tijani Sufi traditions and in Ifa as well, read or heard from people. So Sheikh Ahmed Tijani, who's an 18th century founder of the Tijani Sufi order, wrote that the Adamic personhood, the human being, encompasses the entirety of existent beings. So in reality, each Gnostic, Arif, contains all of the angels and all of the existent beings, from the heavenly throne to the earthly canopy. He sees all of them in himself, each one individually. So we have kind of a combination of both of Césaire's things here. And many, many Babalawo whom I interviewed for my research told me some version of man is a small world, everything in the world, all of the powers of the world exist inside of him. So as this continued and as I became more and more familiar and fluent in Orisha and Sufi traditions, I almost started doing kind of Sufi commentaries on Fanon or Ifa commentaries on things that I read in Fanon. So for example, when I read this famous statement of Fanon from Black Skin, White Mass, I'm not a prisoner of history. I should not seek therefore the meaning of my destiny. I shall not seek therefore the meaning of my destiny. I should constantly remind myself that the real leap consists in introducing invention into existence. In the world through which I travel, I am endlessly creating myself. I was reminded of the Ifa tradition or doctrine about Ori, which at once means head, destiny, heavenly double, which we choose in heaven outside of time, and which is praised as Orimi Eledami, Ori, my creator. So this destiny of mine creates me, even though I choose it, and it's outside of history, outside of time. And that creation. I was also reminded of the Sufi doctrine of Tajdid al-Khalq, which states that the world, the entire cosmos, is perpetually created and returned to God at every instant, including time itself, kind of like the images on a screen. And that this creation, according to some Sufis like Ibn Arabi, is actually determined by us. So it's not just God acting, but we, in a sense, determine God's actions. So he writes that the will is a relationship that follows from knowledge, while knowledge is a relationship that follows the object of knowledge. The object of knowledge is you and your states. Knowledge displays no effects within the object of knowledge. On the contrary, it's the object of knowledge that displays its effects, that influences, that determines knowledge. The object gives to knowledge what it actually is in itself, even though the real determines the property. That's the real God, one of the names of the real in Sufism, but the favorite name is Al-Haq, the real. He only effuses existence upon you, and you determine your own property. Hence, you should praise none but yourself and blame none but yourself. For the real, praise only means for effusing existence, and that's, since that belongs to him, not you. So without getting into the nitty-gritties of Sufi doctrine here, here we have an example of perpetual self-creation, kind of a la Fanon. And in the words of Rumi, says, hurry, speak fresh words so that the world may be refreshed. So many other quotes from Fanon: no attempt must be made to encase man for this his destiny to be free, reminded me very much the whole kind of central point of Ibn Arabi's and the Sufi tradition coming from him is that what it means for human beings to be made in the divine image means that they're non-delimited, just as the divine is non-delimited. In fact, there's so much so that we are non-delimited even by non-delimitation. We can't even say that we're limited by being unlimited. And the whole point of the spiritual practice for Ibn Arabi is to untie these knots in the human being, to completely set oneself free from all delimitations. Fanon's famous end to Black Skin, White Mass, oh, my body, make me always a man who questions, reminded me very much on the Sufi take of this prayer of the Prophet of Islam. My God, increase me in bewilderment of me. This bewilderment, they say, is perpetually changing, because God can't be encapsulated, the real can't be encapsulated in any one perspective, description, account. And so all that's left for is bewilderment, this perpetual renewal and change, never stopping with a fixed notion of the real, fixed relationship. Similarly, Fanon's notion of the tabula rasa, which is very important to his thought, plays a role similar to, but distinct from, that of the fitra in Sufi thought and writing. The fitra is kind of the primordial human nature, again, completely unconditioned, even being unconditioned by being unconditioned. So this gives you a sense of kind of what I was up to in and what's continued to happen as I've been reading these groups of thinkers together. In my head, they're all kind of speaking to each other in all kinds of interesting ways. But I noticed in the secondary literature, in particular, these thinkers are not treated the same. These figures are not treated the same. Those on the left-hand side, those writing in European languages, are treated as thinkers, as theorists. Even despite some initial resistance, they've been granted entry into various canons of theory and method. And they're studied more or less on their own terms. People try to figure out what they said and apply their insights to other things. Whereas those thinkers on the right, with a few exceptions, by and large, are treated as sources of data, and exogenous social scientific methods are applied to them and their traditions. And in a kind of metaphorical way, this even shows up in Fanon's own work, in which he says, how many times have I been stopped in broad daylight by the police, who took me for an Arab, and when they discovered my origins, they hastily apologized. They're saying, we know full well a Martinican is different from an Arab. I would protest violently, but I was told, you don't know them. So just as Fanon, the police let Fanon through, let him pass because he was Martinican and not Arab, Fanon's writings have been allowed to pass into the mainstream of academia, whereas those of his Algerian contemporaries, even his other revolutionaries, have not. They've been treated differently because they're Arab. Now, I want to turn now to this, despite the fact that Fanon was a psychiatrist and spent a lot of his time treating Algerians and working alongside of and fighting alongside of Algerians in the revolution, I want to turn to this "you don't know them" part. In some ways, I think the police were right, that there were aspects of Fanon's thought. For example, if you read anything Fanon wrote about Islam or kind of African religions in general, you'll see there's a marked ignorance there. Again, this is David Macy notes this in his biography of Fanon. He said in 1955, the FN leader Mustafa Lasharaf suggested that he and Fanon collaborate on a book together, but Fanon declined, telling Lasharaf that Fanon was still thinking in European terms. And decades later, Lasharaf reaffirmed that despite his political sympathies, Fanon was still something of an assimilé, that is still hostage to the European milieu, still thinking in European terms. Now, this is brilliantly explored in an undergraduate thesis. And even though it's an undergraduate thesis, it's better than most graduate dissertations I've read and could easily be made into a great book manuscript. I hope it will be soon. That I had the honor of supervising by a brilliant Harvard graduate named Anwar Almesh. And she writes in her thesis on the kind of limits of the Fanonian project in the Algerian problem space. She says there was a significant gap between Fanon's animating concerns and those of the Algerians he was working among. It was both caused by and reveals implicit theoretical commitments to the traditional modern binary that rendered some Algerian concerns and the vibrant debates that surrounded them illegible to him as a theorist. These theoretical commitments, rather than, as is widely contended, producing a radically open Fanonian praxis, in fact make possible some futures while foreclosing others, thereby limiting access to the very Algerian narratives that may have had the potential to interrupt the epistemic project of colonial modernity. In turn, this move restricts Fanon's and our world-making resources as theorists and practitioners. Now, one of the most outstanding, if not the most outstanding kind of representative of the Fanonian tradition in contemporary times is Sylvia Wynter, who we'll say more about in a second. But I think this same dynamic that you see that Anwar Almesh diagnosed in Fanon's is at play in Wynter's work, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. And we can see it in this quote that she has in an interview with Catherine McKittrick, talking about a recent report about climate change in Time magazine. So she says the terrifying thing with this Time report is that they think that the causes of global warming are human activities, but they're not. The Maasai who were and are being displaced have nothing to do with global warming. It's all of us, the Western and mimetically Westernized middle classes, who are driving global climate change. After we fell into the trap of modeling ourselves on the model of the Western bourgeoisie's liberal monohumanist Mantu, and we'll get to what Mantu means in a sec. But mind you, at the same time, just prior to, during, and after the anti-colonial and civil rights struggles, what other model was there? Except, of course, for the hitherto neglected, yet uniquely ecumenically human model put forward by Frantz Fanon from what had been his activist gaze from below, anti-bourgeois, anti-colonial, anti-imperial perspective. Now, the interesting thing I want to point out here is she says there are only two models available. There's the Western bourgeoisie liberal kind of colonial model, and then there's the Fanonian model. But there's a third term here that she invokes and then erases, which is the Maasai. And so why are the Maasai not a model that can be considered? And so this, hopefully by the end of the talk, we'll see why the Maasai get left out of Wynter's consideration here and why that's a big problem. Oh, sorry. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to make you dizzy. All right, so now to understand this, we have to turn to what Wynter meant by Mantu. So now I have to turn to Wynter's theory of man versus his human others. So Wynter argues, kind of rebelling against the earlier Marxist formation, that we humans cannot pre-exist our cosmogonies or origin myths or stories or narratives any more than a bee at the purely biological level of life can pre-exist its beehive. That is, she says that early societies and civilizations create their own worlds through language, their own conceptions of human being. And these early ones map these structuring principles of their societies onto the stars to make them seem to be supernaturally mandated, that they seem to be extra humanly structured. That is, we as human beings, as societies, we create ourselves, we create our human structures, we create the meaning of what it is to be human, but then we occlude the fact that we created this. And we experience these orders of existence as natural or supernatural. So it's kind of like a CAPTCHA codes. You know, we create a computer program to determine who's a human being and who's a machine. Well, then we treat it as if it's kind of objective. Or naively with AI facial recognition. People write and make these codes and train these AI recognition systems on sets of data. But then we naively forget this, or we occlude the fact that we made this and naively assume that it's objective, that it's superhuman. So she clarifies further, said, look, it's against Marx, she says, the phenomenon of culture rather than nature or history provides the ground of all human existential reality or actuality. Clarifying, while it is we humans who ourselves produce our social order, we are in reality its authors and its agents. We also produce, though, at the same time, the mechanisms of occultation which serve to keep this fact opaque to us. And so she explains in one of my favorite quotes of hers, one of the most quoted, very poetic one of her sentences: human beings are magical, bios and logos, as flesh and word, words made flesh, muscle and bone animated by hope and desire, belief materialized in deeds, deeds which crystallize our realities. So basically what Wynter's saying is that our bodies don't pre-exist the stories, the origin myths that we tell about them, and that in fact determine what they are. They exist in this kind of relationship of mutual determination. Now she traces this theory of man versus its human other. That is this singular limited notion of man that then gets overrepresented as if it were all humanity. So beginning in the medieval Christian period, she says, based on this heaven-earth dichotomy, or the dichotomy, which is then mapped onto the dichotomy between the spirit and the flesh, the alive and the dead, this is produces a code through which one knows, not just knows what a human being is, but through which one actually experiences being. And through this code, we get the social divisions of the priest and the laity, the Christian and the heathen. And this is what she calls a theological code that reigns in the medieval Christian world. So you have Christian men. Then through this process of de-godding, the secularization of knowledge that begins to happen in the Renaissance, the early modern period, we get the invention of man, or what she calls man one, which referring to Foucault's invention of man, which is the rational man and political subject, which is defined against its human others, right? So whereas the Christian is defined against the heathen, the priest is defined against the laity, just as heaven is defined against earth, rational man is defined against its human others. In Europe, meaning the insane, and in the so-called New World, in the Americas, because this is precisely when this emerges, and this Atlantic crossing is very important in determining this new man one, Indian serfs and Negro slaves. And this division between man and the human others is based on the dichotomy, the code dividing rational man and the irrational animal. So you have the political subject and the enslaved, the colonized. Then through the emergence in the 19th century of this, what she calls a half-mythic Darwinian origin narrative, this mutates again her word, so we get man two, biological man. That is, human being is defined by biology. And the code here shifts to be between the evolved and the non-evolved, the naturally selected for and the naturally selected against, that you get in eugenics and Malthusian notions of scarcity and human progress. And so you get the evolved, usually the Western European, the intelligent, the wealthy, versus the poor racial others, who are othered on the basis of this biological code, not just a code based on rationality or law, but now grounded in biology. And again, for Wynter, this is a code that we create, but we experience as being natural, as not being a human creation. And so she writes that the value difference between bourgeois man and its working class or poor others is as superculturally and extra-humanly ordained as is the projected value difference between Indo-European peoples and all native peoples. And she argues that capitalism is produced as a result of this particular genre of the human. And now within capitalism, we get the emergence of Homo economicus, which means to be, that is the human being as one who participates in the economic world, and that to be shut out of the economic order is to be shut out of social existence. So she says, for the first time, social existence is defined purely in economic terms. And she said, this is the current structure of our disciplines, of our thinking, in which we experience the biological nature of man, even though that's created through our disciplines as something super cultural, extra humanly ordained. But she argues that it's not. Right. So again, she says, no order can exist except as it exists within the logic of a formulation of a general order of existence. And this is elaborated by intellectuals, whether theologians or shamans or ourselves. The heresy I'm putting forward is that capitalism is itself a function of the reproduction of man, that is man too, this biological conception of man whose conception we institute in our disciplines. And so one important consequence of this is that despite all of our radical posturing as academics, in general, we tend to institute man too, just like the humanist scholars before us instituted man one, and the clergy instituted Christian man before. Right, so Wynter also presents this schema of man versus the human others, in which this singular, limited notion of man overrepresents itself as if it were all humanity, even as it defines itself against its opposite, these human others, as a disease cure model. So in the medieval Christian order, we have the disease of original sin, and the cure of salvation is mediated by and through the church. In man one, the ratiocentric formation, we have madness or irrationality as the disease, and reason mediated by the rational rule of the state, and state here being the white European colonial state as the cure. In man two, the biocentric formation, we have scarcity and dysgenesis, that is human genes that are not naturally selected for, that don't do well, low IQ, etc., as the disease and scarcity of resources, and health and wealth mediated by the invisible hands of natural selection and the free market as the cure. So she argues that the problems we confront, that of the scandalous inequities between rich and poor countries, of global warming, the disastrous effects of climate change, large-scale epidemics of AIDS, these are not accidental to the system. These are not kinks to be ironed out. These are features. These are emblematic of the actual order of knowledge. And she says they can only be solved if we, for the first time, can experience ourselves, not only as we do now, as this or that genre of human. She calls each of these man one, man two genres of human, but also as human, a new mode of experiencing ourselves in which every mode of being human, every form of life that has ever been enacted is a part of us, and we a part of them. And she uses Césaire's phrase, a humanism made to the measure of man, to describe this. In a later interview, she further explains the only cure will be a transformation of the whole society and an entirely new knowledge order altogether. Otherwise, we'll remain trapped in this. This new order she calls the second emergence. For her, this is second emergence because the first emergence is that of human beings sometime a long time ago on the East African plains emerging as Homo sapiens, as a self-narrating species, a species that can act on itself through language to create, become self-conscious and narrate what it means to be human and create these human worlds. This she calls the third event, the first event being the Big Bang, the second event being the emergence of biological life, and then the third event, the emergence of human beings as this kind of new form of life that consciously acts upon itself. And so she calls for a science of the word, borrowing this again from Césaire, which is a hybrid bios logos, a hybrid biological, scientific, and humanities, you could say language science, to describe homo narrans, this, human beings as those who narrate themselves, who create themselves through language. And she gets into details of how this can work with how language and the cultures we create can modify our neuroscientific pathways for dopamine rewards and things like that. But she wants this new science to combine the humanities and the sciences that consciously wields what she calls sociogeny or autopoiesis, which is the understanding of how we create ourselves, how we create these genres of humanity in order to create a humanity made to the measure of man. And in this, education is key as a form of initiation into a genre of being human. All right, so both kind of summing up Wynter's approach for this and also illustrating some differences, which maybe we can get into in the Q&A. Fanon writes, when I search for man in the technique and style of Europe, I see only a succession of negations of man and an avalanche of murders. So Wynter's trying to get us out of this. And she writes, do you see, because we've been doing it, we've been putting it in place, but we've been doing it non-consciously as a spider spins its web. But the fact is, we've also been changing these conceptions of the human. All great movements of history have actually been changes and struggles against this prevailing conception. Now, for the first time, we would come into full consciousness of the fact that it's we who are the agents and authors of ourselves, and we do it according to rules. And these rules function in the same way as for the first human cultures. When we look at circumcision from a biocentric perspective, all we can see is genital mutilation because we can't afford to see what we're seeing. We're seeing the first writing on the flesh, as Nietzsche says, the tremendous labor of the human upon itself, by means of which it makes itself calculable. So in instituting ourselves, we institute our order of consciousness. And as Fanon would say, we have to become enemies to our own order of consciousness in order to produce a new order of consciousness. All right, so this is kind of just a summary, very quick, of Wynter's very complicated accounts and theories. And I think that the critique of this account can come in when you start to look at the role that Africa plays in Wynter's thought. And Africa in Wynter's thought, I think, has two main roles and one kind of subsidiary. So one, Wynter mounts, to my mind, what is one of the best critiques of African studies ever written. And in this, she borrows a lot from Mudimbe. So she says, to thereby know and represent Africa through an immense gallery of mirrors, which reflect only the image of Western and Westernized selves, our desires and passions through mirrors which deform. If Mudimbe imposes in the invention of Africa, then both the worldview of autocentric Africa and that of African traditional systems of thought, rather than being known and represented in the framework of their own rationality, have hitherto been known by academics and represented by both Western and Western educated African analysts by means of these conceptual systems based in a Western epistemological locus. It suggests that not even we ourselves as African and Black diaspora critics and filmmakers can in the normal course of things be entirely freed from the functioning of these rules of representation, and therefore from knowing and representing the cultural universe of Africa through the same Western gallery of mirrors which deform, even when this deformation is effected in the most radically oppositional terms which seek to challenge rather than to reinforce deformation. So that's a long, very convoluted sentence, but I think actually quite cogently, Wynter is actually diagnosing some of the problems her own work has with dealing with Africa and African traditions here in this passage. Let's see if I can move on to the next slide. Here we go. All right, so in Africa and Wynter's thought has two main kind of functions. The first, as a mirror to relevize and reveal the similarly provincial or culturally specific, or in her terms, auto-inscripted, that is self-created, self-determined, and cognitively closed nature of the modern Western order of knowledge that over-represents itself as if it were natural and universal, and its concomitant world system. And number two, as the site of her own origin myth of this kind of evolutionary first emergence on the plains of Africa somewhere in deep time. So you can see the first function here in this wonderful article. She has genital mutilation or symbolic rebirth, or symbolic birth, female circumcision, lost origins, and the aculturalism of feminist Western thought, which is really a kind of running commentary on a Nigerian lawyer's article, Bridges and Barricades, Rethinking Polemics and Intransigence in the Campaign Against Female Circumcision. So here Wynter writes, I propose that we use this antagonism between feminist opponents of female circumcision and the African proponents as the point of departure for the elaboration of a transcultural critique of both positions, one able to reveal the respective cultural relativity of each of their conceptions of the human, to reveal thereby the relativity of the purely biologized conception of the human, on whose basis alone feminism is enabled to posit the existence of an supposedly acultural category, woman, and thereby propose an emancipatory project ostensibly encompassing of all women, rather than one as is vertically merely unifying of Western middle-class women with a westernized middle class and essentially urban professional native peers. So Wynter goes through this article that tries to go back and forth between the two sides of the debate on female circumcision to show how they're both limited. And so tries to use the African case to show just how that's limited and cognitively closed, so is the Western one. So she kind of brilliantly concludes, it says, when Professor Obiora, this Nigerian lawyer, sets out to address how relevant circumcision protestations contradict feminist principles, the protestations that, as she shows later, must attack both the women who are circumcisers and the women who fervently believe in the practice, my proposal is that we should consider the possibility that there's no contradiction, that the generic reference subject of feminist discourse is not all women, but rather it's westernized bourgeois women. And this mirrors the fact that the reference subject of our present order of knowledge, man, and its discourse of liberal humanism is not all humans, but only those who attain Western bourgeois status. So the subject of feminist discourse is only the culturally Western or westernized middle-class woman who alone can, within the terms of our present order, come to constitute the generic overrepresented woman. As such, she is one who must necessarily claim, as does her male middle-class peer, a monopoly of humanity. So here we see the kind of first function. Now, moving to a quote from another article of hers in which we'll see both functions of Africa. So she says, rather, it is the way in which in Africa you can say there's an other exists to what the West calls human. When you're looking at voodoo, you're seeing an other to what the monotheistic religions have called human. We are going back to our very origin as humans and the process of harmonization. And that to me is what Africa has to offer when we look at it this way. So Africa and Africana traditions like Vodou offer us this glimpse into the origins of humanity, of this first process of the third event of the first emergence. Now she says, by the way, taking this magnificent body of knowledge that's been built up by the West, but seeing it differently from them because they could not see others as alternative forms of life. Right? So she wants to use these African examples to show how the Western example is similarly cognitively closed. So she used the example of Evans Pritchard's work amongst the Azande. So he says, when they says about the Azande and the witchcraft, it's the very texture of their thought, and they couldn't think that their thought was wrong, not as long as they were Azande. So it is with us as the embodiment of ethno-class man in the mode of the Western bourgeoisie. All of our beliefs about IQ, about the bell curve, these are the very texture of our thought, and we cannot normally think that our thought is wrong. We can't get outside of it. So this is what Africa gives us, the fundamental rules and a mirror in which to examine how also similarly our thought, quote unquote, is similarly cognitively closed. So these are the roles that Africa plays in Wynter's thought. Okay, so what are the problems with this? So one problem is that of allochronism. This term was coined by anthropologist Johannes Fabian to describe the persistent and systematic tendency to place the reference of anthropology in a time other than the present of the producer of anthropological discourse. That is, when you're looking at Vodou or any other African traditions, they exist now. They have their own histories of development. Now, granted, they have their own cosmologies, their own theories of time, but you're not looking back into the past when you speak to a Babalawo, when you speak to a Mambo. They're part of different timelines. They have their own timelines. And you see this in Wynter's work. This gets repeated again and again. So she says, we're looking for new cognitive terms that would therefore call for the disenchanting of all belief from Vodun, which she calls the root of all belief, to our contemporary westernized zone. So again, she's placing Vodun and all other Africana traditions kind of in the past and our own westernized traditions in the present. And that's, in and of itself, that's somewhat problematic. But when we get to Wynter's actual kind of teleological project, it becomes much more problematic. So why do you want to disenchant Vodun? Why is it that you want to do that? So she discusses a similar problem with relation to other anthropologists, saying that anthropologists they study and critically examine origin stories of the people they study. They nevertheless hesitate at the threshold of their own origin stories. They're reluctant to explore and critically analyze or look at their own origin myths, whether religious or secular. This reluctance is a law-like one, hence one that they share with the peoples that they study and who are classified as their quote-unquote native informants. In turn, the authors continue, the anthropologists are akin to the groups they study, and that these Western academics, intellectuals treat their own stories of origin as taboo, set apart, and sacred, just like whether the Judeo-Christian religious story of creation or the non-religious, ostensibly objective Darwinian story of evolution. So this is a quote from Wynter, but I argue that Wynter does this with her own origin story, with her own origin myth. She doesn't subject it to the same relativizing, auto-inscripting analysis that she does all other origin stories. And what I want to argue is that not only are African traditions something in the past, but they also don't have the same, they're not cognitively closed in the same way that Wynter seems to think that they are, or think that our present order of knowledge is. So again, she says, for the first time with this kind of notion of autopoiesis or auto-inscription, we come into full consciousness of the fact that it's we who are the agents and authors of ourselves, and that we're doing it according to rules. So anyone who knows something about Afro-Atlantic traditions, Orisha traditions, Yoruba Orisha traditions in particular, will know that this just isn't true. And these traditions are probably the furthest you can get from cognitively closed. So Wynter writes all such sacred theological discourses, Judaism, Islamism, Christianity, for example, continue to function in the cosmogonically mandated, cognitively closed terms that are indispensable to the enacting of their respective behavior-inducing and behavior-regulating, fictively use-socializing imperatives. That is, everything religious is cognitively closed. But when you look at traditions like Ifa, other Orisha traditions, other Afro-Atlantic traditions, then they're not cognitively closed, and they're very much aware of the fact that people make gods. So there's a Yoruba proverb, "Bi eniyan si, imole si," which is if people were not, the gods would be not. That is, people are aware that they make the gods who make them. It's a famous Yoruba proverb, the Orisha that doesn't hear you when you cry or doesn't help you when you worship it, get rid of it. Literally throw it in the bush and get a new one. So again, not cognitively closed at all, very much aware of viable alternatives. And this is somewhat accounts for the famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, Yoruba religious promiscuity and fluidity in practice. This practice of auto-inscription, you could say, is almost directly translates the Yoruba ituronite, which literally means self-reflection and self-recreation through initiation and practice. As one Odu of Ifa says, if I'm created, I will recreate myself. I will observe all the taboos. Having been created, I shall now recreate myself. As Matori writes in his Fetish Revisited, the real world Brazilian, Cuban, Haitian, and Nigerian worshippers of the Afro-Atlantic gods are as complex and ambivalent as any European social theorist. The difference is that few of the priests will construct the foreign other as the antithesis of their ideal selves. Rather, it's in the interaction with the other, the relationship with the other, that quite normatively makes them who they are. Just as, and I add here, some of the Abrahamic religions profess the exclusion of other religions, the Enlightenment and its science have professed a relationship of oppositeness and antagonism to the Afro-Atlantic religions. So just very quickly, you want to read more about how this works in Ifa, my book has some info on this. Matori's book also has a lot of great stuff on this. So when Islam and Christianity came in contact with Orisha traditions, or with Ifa in particular, they were integrated into the tradition as Orisha traditions. And the Orisha traditions themselves are not a single tradition, but rather a kind of amalgamation or a conglomeration or constellation of distinct but mutually recognizing traditions. So the variety of alternatives, so it's very much not a cognitively closed system. You really can see this in Haitian Vodou, particularly in Southern Haitian Vodou, where you have 21 different nations of spirits that are worshipped from various different parts of the continent. Petwo, the Wada, the Gede, spirits from West Africa, Dahomey, Yoruba land, the Congo spirits. You even have Senegal spirits or Muslim spirits from Senegal. Islam is integrated into Candomblé, the Brazilian Afro-Atlantic traditions through these Musurumi spirits. So to cut a long story short, these traditions are not cognitively closed. They consciously participate in or do what Wynter calls autopoiesis, auto-inscription. It's not something new. It's not being done for the first time. And traditions like Ifa function as very much what Wynter is calling for, and Césaire was calling for before her, a science of the word. That is a science of origin myths that deploys these origin myths in order to create particular outcomes. And thus I argue that these traditions are kind of already existing foundations of humanisms made to the measure of the world. They're not defining themselves against another, rather they incorporate another. This isn't limited to Afro-Atlantic or Orisha traditions as well too. You see this in West African tradition, Islamic traditions as well too, particularly Sufism. So it's a wonderful example of this kind of science of the word, non-cognitively closed nature in Amadou Hampâté Bâ's account of his teacher, Cherno Bokar, both of whom are Tijani Sufis. So he writes that Cherno Bokar used to work with a traditional Dogon healer named Ankamba, who possessed a profound knowledge of medicinal plants. From the time he met Cherno Bokar, the two of them began to cure people together. Cherno from the Islamic perspective and Ankamba from the Dogon perspective. They joined the two approaches to cure quite a few illnesses. Whenever Ankamba brought a plant, Cherno would search for its analogous Quranic verse. It was a kind of medicine at once physical and mental. Ankamba was incredible. He had surpassed the ordinary level of things. He was constantly in contact with plants, constantly in nature, constantly busy searching, meditating, examining. All right, so give you more examples of this kind of autopoiesis, or the notion of self-creation within Sufi traditions. Some quotes from the very, very massively influential Andalusian North African Sufi theorist Ibn Arabi, who writes, "No individual can escape having a belief concerning his Lord. Through it, he resorts to him and seeks him. No believer believes in any God other than what he has made in himself, for the God of beliefs is made. The believer sees nothing but themselves and what they have made within themselves." So again, we have autopoiesis, auto-inscription. And he writes then, "Beware of becoming delimited by a specific nodding and disbelieving in everything else, lest the great good escape you. Or rather, knowledge of the situation as it is in itself will escape you, being yourself a kind of hula, a prime matter, for all forms of beliefs, for God is wider and more tremendous than that he should be constricted by one nodding rather than another. For he says, wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God." Elsewhere he writes, "It's incumbent upon the folk of Allah to know the doctrine, the ilm, the knowledge of every religion, millah, so that they can contemplate him in every form and never stand in the position of denial. For he permeates existence, so none denies him, but someone who is delimited. But the folk of Allah follow him whose folk they are, so his property flows over them, and his property is the lack of delimitation. For he possesses all-pervading being, so his folk possess all-pervading vision. When someone delimits his being, he delimits his own vision of him. Such a one is not of the folk of Allah. And again, so here we see this kind of humanism made to the measure of the world, although humanism in a different sense of what the human is. And again, he writes elsewhere, he who is more perfect than the perfect is he who believes every belief concerning him. He recognizes him in faith, in proofs, and in heresy or deviance, ilhad, since ilhad is to deviate from one belief to another specific belief. Here we have this again, perpetual transformation of belief. So if you want your eye to hit the mark, witness him with every eye, for he pervades all things through self-disclosure. In every form he has a face, and in every knower a state. And here we have a neat parallel with what Wynter's comment that were quoted earlier, that these problems can only be solved if for the first time, but maybe not for the first time, we experience ourselves not only as we do now as this or that genre of human, but as human, in which we experience every mode of being human, every form of life that has ever been enacted, and every part of us, we are part of them. This strikes me as very similar to what Ibn Arabi is talking about with seeing with every eye from every perspective. Recalling her quote about the spider spinning its web, Ashushtari, another North African Andalusian Sufi from the 13th century, a contemporary of Ibn Arabi, has this wonderful poem in which he writes, "We are like a silkworm enveloped by what we fashion. In pushing back the bounds, we're imprisoned within them." How often reason, for him, reason is what creates this cocoon, destroys the bystander, and how often it rightly guides the traveler. So for Shushtari, the point is, our fitra, our original nature is we're completely open to the world. Then we construct, here it's a we, not just an I. We construct the culture, beliefs, all of these other things about reality around us, which constrain us. But the point is to get beyond that, to have a direct experience and understanding of the real as such. Now, Ibn Arabi's stepson describes this experience of spiritual realization, of the real, experiencing the real as such, as the tasting or the experience, the dhawq of perfect human beings, has affirmed that everything is in everything. Nothing has any essential stability and something from which it cannot change. On the contrary, everything is on the verge of being transformed into something else. This is the situation of all wujud, being or consciousness. This constant flow is the divine journey from the first, non-manifest unseen to the realm of the visible. No one tastes or experiences this journey and reaches its source except he whose essence has come to be non-delimited. Then the bonds are loosened, the contingent properties, states, attributes, stations, configurations, acts, and beliefs. He's not confined by any of them. By his essence, he flows in everything, just as wujud, being or consciousness, flows in the realities of all things without end or beginning. When the real gave me to witness this tremendous place of witnessing, I saw that its possessor has no fixed entity and no reality. So an incredible description. And again, we find a near parallel in one of Wynter's writings. It said, given the diversity of human religions, as well as human cultures, that men and women have never been any one particular thing or had any particular nature to tie them down metaphysically. And that instead we become human only by means of the conceptions or theories of being human that are specific to each culture. There is stubborn resistance to this recognition, though. Foucault shows by our present fundamental arrangements of knowledge and their disciplinary paradigms. Does indeed so serve to tie us down metaphysically to its theoretical fiction of a fixed human nature. So again, this parallels between Qunawi, Ibn Arabi's stepson, and Wynter. For the sake of time, I have to skip this. You find almost identical passages in Emir Abdul Qadir, the leader of the Algerian resistance to the French, in that of Cherno Bokar, Malian Tijani Sufi as well too. He describes these kind of three levels of spiritual realization in terms of three lights: a fire, a sun, and then finally the fire is a limited light, the sun is a kind of all-encompassing light, and then finally the black light is a light that isn't even limited by its opposite. The sun has an opposite, the shadow, the black light has no opposite. And these correspond to three stages of faith or knowledge: solid, liquid, and gaseous, but I'll have to go through that quickly for the sake of time. But the descriptions are all this. So this is a through line, running through Sufism, particularly Sufism in kind of North Africa and West Africa. So we get a sense from the Sufi tradition of a hierarchy of humanity, with those who've realized this kind of non-delimited state at the top. But the top, this kind of prophetic station of no station, completely non-delimited black light, collapses all distinctions into a perpetually renewed realization of the identity and unity of all beings. So it kind of takes the great chain of being and twists it into a Mobius strip of something that continually whirls around. So this, you can see this in Sheikh Ahmed Tijani, the founder of the Tijaniya Sufi order, the most popular Sufi order on the African continent, maybe in the world, writes that his being, God's blessing and peace upon him, the prophet who occupies this highest station, is the spirit of everything in the universe. And there's no existence for anything without him, even for the non-believers. And so this kind of exceeds the codes of inclusion, exclusion that Wynter talks about, and that seem to exist at the lower or the early levels of spiritual realization in Sufism. So he writes, there's a prophetic saying, do not exalt yourselves over God by exalting yourself over his lands and his servants. Whoever exalts himself over the servants of God exalts himself over God, thinking himself greater than God. Verifying this tahqiq, this hadith, the saying of the prophet, is found in what we said before, which is that all created entities are levels, arrangements, maratib of the real. Okay. So ceremonies never lost the view from Orisha and Sufi traditions. So even though I had to go through this very quickly, hopefully you can see that far from being cognitively closed, both Orisha, Afro-Atlantic traditions, and Sufi traditions are the very opposite of cognitive closed. They're very well aware of viable alternatives. In fact, these viable alternatives are included within them in certain ways. Autopoiesis, or this idea of sociogeny or auto-inscription, are not novel to them, and they contain already existing sciences of the word, and either already existing or the foundations for humanisms made to the measure of man. And in these traditions, not just man, but the whole cosmos. But why doesn't Wynter see this? It's not like Wynter wasn't aware of Afro-Atlantic traditions. So work Black Metamorphosis has some of the best scholarship on, let's say, John Canoe in Jamaica, Afro-Atlantic traditions in the Caribbean. Why does she overrepresent her own evolutionary myth of origin as the origin of all other origin myths? I argue that you can see this actually in a quote that Wynter quotes by Mudimbe. So he says, the idea of Africa has mingled together new scientific and ideological interpretations with the semantic fields and concepts like primitivism and savagery. The geographic expansion of Europe and its civilization was then a holy saga of mythic proportions. The only problem, and it's a big one, is that as this civilization developed, it submitted the world to its memory. So I argue that this is what's going on here, that Africa and African traditions have been submitted to the memory of the West's past. That is, they've just been assumed to be just like medieval Christianity. And so the inheritance of the West's past, they've been submitted to a metaphysics, a cosmology, a teleology that are alien to them, and to this religious secular dichotomy that is, again, alien and exogenous to them, and a concomitant aversion to. So I think Wynter inherited this religious secular dichotomy and related aversion to an illegibility of traditions rooted in a kind of transcendence that exceeds what Césaire calls the half-starved cosmology or anthropology of modern science, Wynter's man too. But what I want to argue is that precisely because they are rooted in such perspectives of transcending transcendence, these traditions, Afro-Atlantic traditions, Sufism, can accomplish precisely what Wynter seeks, because they offer a particular immanent contingent form amongst other forms of being human that then opens up onto the transcendence of all forms. And in the transcendence of this transcendence, as its immanence in all forms, as we saw in the quotes. And even though I didn't get to quote this within Orisha traditions, it's there as well too. So I argue that the Fanonian, the Wynterian break with the current order of knowledge is actually limited by its limited and limiting vision of the real, that it carries over from this current order of knowledge that we're trying to get out of. This nodding, this God created in belief, and therefore its limited and limiting notion of human possibility. Let's see if I can. So Marika Rose, in a recent essay, writes brilliantly, says, taking seriously Wynter's account of the entanglement of disenchantment with the epochal ships in the genres of human beings, to suggest then that disenchantment isn't so much about the disappearance of magic and mystery, so much as the transformation. It's about the violent destruction of old social and metaphysical bonds, which tied people to one another and to the world around them or the world around us, in order to bind them to new masters who are appropriating for themselves both legal and sovereign power, that is to nation states and European citizens, which is to say slavers and colonizers. So given that it's not so much about disenchantment, but about new gods being worshipped. It's not getting rid of the gods, but worshiping new gods. And since these gods have been so petty and cruel, I think it's high time we heed the Yoruba proverb and throw them in the bush and get new ones. Oops, sorry. Uh-oh. Okay. This, however, involves, as Wynter argues, I agree with her on this, a complete rethinking of the orders of knowledge and our disciplines. So William Chittick, probably the foremost scholar of Ibn Arabi in English, describes his view of the non-delimited nature of human nature, saying once it's understood that the proper human role in the cosmos is to manifest the divine essence in a global and plenary fashion, it's easy to see that the main currents of modern thought are designed to keep people as far away from this central point as possible. This is because science, technology, and the other branches of modern learning, not to speak of politics, are grounded in ignorance of human nature. They think of it as a fixed thing. Modern forms of knowledge falsify the human self by defining it in terms of ever more narrowly focused disciplines: biology, neurophysiology, genetics, anthropology, psychology, history, economics, and so on. Modern intellectual currents, the media, popular culture, make people comfortable with the false notion that they belong to fixed stations. They're one thing and not another. Once people lose sight of the non-delimitation of the true human state, they lose the possibility of thinking about perfection, much less achieving it. Modern knowledge tells us who we are not, can never tell us who we are. Only a perspective rooted in the station of no station, this kind of fluid Sufi notion, can show the way to the central point. All right, now to conclude. All right, so conclusion, with or Wynter. So if we come back to this original quote, I'm on the Time Report. So the Maasai aren't causing global warming. It's not humans that are causing global warming. It's man two that's causing climate, man one and man two that are causing climate change. But why is it that Wynter was not able to see the Maasai as a valid model? One, because for her, they were placed in the past because of this inheritance of cosmology, and they were placed in the past because they were deemed to have false consciousness. They were deemed to be a cognitively closed society and model. But I don't think that's the case. And now, charitably, we could read Wynter's account as a kind of upaya, a liberating ruse. In the Buddhist formulation, a boat that burns when it gets to the other shore, or a ladder that you kick away, something that, given the dominance and the hegemony of the biocentric order of knowledge of man two, Wynter's is kind of like an escape hatch. It's a way to get us out of it. But I would argue that even this escape hatch still carries too much of the baggage of the myth of the West past with it. Now, this is not to say that communities of Orisha devotees or African Sufis were or are perfect, utopian, or egalitarian, but rather that they conceive of and practice freedom in ways that are difficult to recognize in modern ratiocentric or biocentric schemas, as Wynter's own work demonstrates, but also that their traditions contain powerful resources and still present ceremonies, initiations, forms of education, whose neglect is both symptomatic and causative of many of our present woes. Okay, so the main question animating Wynter's thought, Fanon's thought, how do we get free? How do we get out of these orders of knowledge, these practices, these catastrophes happening all around us? So for Wynter, it's a transcultural evolution of the hegemonic paradigm. We shift from man to kind of unlimited conception of man, a humanism made to the measure of the world. So there's this kind of evolution from Christian man to man one. Man one she calls a breakthrough, and man two is another breakthrough, leading to the final breakthrough, just like previous events. Fanon is a bit less programmatic. Fanon talks about a leap beyond history, kind of radical and perpetual self-invention and creation through revolutionary praxis. In Ifa, though, has a very different cosmology. It's in the fourth stage, the three stages being the stage of the dead, the living, and the unborn. There's a fourth stage, what Shoinka calls a fourth stage, this ritual intercourse between all these other stages, between the timeless and time, establishing the balance of all forces and beings in order to renew the world and to help all of us fulfill our destinies. That's how we get free from an Ifa perspective. And in Sufism, the way we get free is by spiritually getting free, that is transcending all delimitations through ritual practice. And then you have the eruption of the non-delimited unseen into the delimited seen or order of reality through freed human beings who are non-delimited even by delimitation. And politically or socially, this takes place through the model of the Hijra, which is repeated almost exactly in the the Americas through the model of marronage. So you don't try to transform the existing society or existing order of knowledge. You kind of separate yourself from it until you get strong enough, and then you come back and try to revolt and take over everything. And you see that amongst Muslim communities in the New World, as well as Afro-Atlantic religious communities, Orisha traditions. So to finally conclude, thank you for sticking with me. I know I'm running over. Studying Islamic and indigenous African religious traditions on their own terms reveals that they offer orders of knowledge and ritual that, unlike those Foucault described, don't tie us down, but rather aim to free us from any limiting conceptions of human nature and reality that we may have. That is, they not only aspire towards universality, but in certain modes actually realize pluriversality. Whereas even with its neurosocial modifications, Wynter's work still carries the limiting fiction of biocentrism and a single supersessionist Hegelian and Marxist timeline. But because of the fundamental differences of conception of human nature and reality, African traditions offer a particular delimited mode or modes of being human as one or a few amongst many options that, however, open up to a higher non-delimited reality of human nature / divine reality. Whereas Wynter's theory offers a common biological, common linguistic basis that spawns multiple different possibilities of being human. Because these African traditions open up onto a truly transcendent reality, one that transcends its transcendence to be immanent in all relative conceptions of it, they can similarly exceed and relativize the codes of inclusion, exclusion that define their boundaries and particularities. On the other hand, due to its biocentrism, there's no place for such transcendence in Wynter's historically immanent particular origin myth, which therefore has to over-represent itself as the origin of all origin myths and of all humanity. This replicates the same codes of exclusion that Wynter so cogently diagnoses in other ords of knowledge. That is, she wants to disenchant Vodou, she says. The half-starved cosmology of man too can't contain the transcendence of the truly transcultural that Wynter calls for, whereas I argue that the more capacious cosmologies of Afro-Atlantic and Islamic traditions are actually grounded in this reality. So finally, as Bob Marley sang, quoting the psalmist, the stone that the builder refused will always be the head cornerstone. The stones of Africana and other religious traditions that the builders of the modern world rejected have formed the foundations of the Black and other radical traditions that opposed and continue to oppose the present order of things, and they'll continue to serve as important foundations for the renewal and restoration of humanity and the world beyond its seemingly interminable catastrophes, just as they continue to give us access to, and this is quoting Wynter, a greater truth than any truth we know, which is the truth of who we really are. Thank you very much. I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Oludamini, for an amazing, really transformational analysis of this material. We'd like to invite our audience, again, to send us any comments or questions that you have. You can do so simply by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and just send us those. We'd be very happy to share those with our speaker. There are several dimensions of this that our listeners are curious to explore further. And we have several minutes left for a Q&A. So I was hoping you might begin by just giving to the importance of what you are putting in conversation. You did that on the front end by talking about these range of thinkers and how some have been used as sources of data and others have been used to think with as theorists, and that binary has had tremendous consequences. You're also doing something else. You know, you just published a couple of books that came out last year. One of those was Deep Knowledge, and it is really engaging with the connections and intersections of Tijani Sufism, so indigenous African Islam and Ifa, and it's interesting to see that at work in the material that you're reading through today. You're giving us a very sophisticated account of things. One of those is an account of the accounts of modernity, right? So there's several critiques of the modern world, and you're trying to. One of the things you're doing is moving beyond a set of critiques of the modern in order to get to this transcendence that you're talking about. And so I'd love if you could just move into that question this way. And so let me ask it like this. What do you think is one of the important takeaways of setting into conversation the theoretical critiques of modernity with some of the important insights that emerge in indigenous philosophical traditions. And just to underscore, you were pointing to a couple of genealogies of this. One of those is in the traditions of Ifa, and the others in Tijani Sufism. But what emerges as we put those things in conversation, because usually there aren't, there are scholars who are looking at these accounts, social critical accounts of modernity, and they're not usually studying the traditions that you are engaged with today in order to do that. That is, they're not thinking with those traditions, right?
Right.
And then there are those scholars who are looking at those traditions in order to study them, but they're not necessarily trying to explain some of the things that the social scientists and cultural theorists are explaining.
Right.
So you're putting those together. So what's one of the important takeaways that you can underscore for us?
Yeah, that kind of gets to the heart of the matter. I think one of the most important takeaways, one way you can think of it is Wael Halak has this book, Restating Orientalism, and he talks about two kinds of critiques of modernity. So one, he characterizes Said as being a dissenting scholar, so someone still operating within more or less the same kind of framework, but dissenting, pointing out the contradictions within it, a kind of immanent critique. And then he talks about a subversive author, talks about this figure, René Guénon, who left Europe, went to Egypt, converted to Islam, became a Sufi sheikh, and critiqued European modernity from the perspective of Islamic intellectual traditions. And so kind of articulated a transcendent critique of that. And I think what's going on with the Black radical tradition is more complicated, because I think the Black radical tradition it's not entirely, and Fanon and Wynter, I think, are some of the best to get at this. It's not entirely immanent, but I think it carries these inheritances of it that blunt certain edges of its critique. What's I think really important is that these indigenous or so-called indigenous African traditions contain some of the most profound transcendent critiques of modernity ever, but this completely illegible unless you take them on their own terms. If all you do is treat them as sources of sociological, historical, anthropological data, you miss the important lessons that we have to learn from them, and the lessons that we have to learn really in order to survive. Because as Wynter was saying, it's not the Maasai, it's not the Khoisan people in the Kalahari that are destroying the world. It's us. It's us who are destroying this, us who have gone through the initiation into these particular modes of human being that are not only destroying lots of other genres of people, other kinds of human beings, but are destroying ourselves and destroying the world in which we live for. And we have a lot that we need to learn from these other traditions, but we can only learn from them if we can relativize and undercut our own kind of superiority complexes that are so built into our theories and methods that render the profound critiques that these traditions are making hearable, legible, and intelligible. And I think that's really important. So in the paper that I'm working on that this is based on, I talk about Fanon and Wynter kind of offering a critique or a way from the inside out, from the inside of modernity out, and these traditions offering a way kind of from the outside in. And so if we can find a point where they meet in the middle, I think kind of one trying to tunnel out, one trying to tunnel in, I think if we're using both of these perspectives, both of these kinds of traditions to think with, work with, learn from, we'll be in a much, much better position than just trying to do one, the other. The other part of this, I mean, I do think there are things that Fanon in particular, but also Wynter just get about Western modernity due to their familiarity with it that you don't find in Arabic and Yoruba sources. I mean, the politics of decolonization, Fanon it's like he had a crystal ball. It's amazing there. And you can find some things in kind of principle form, but it's really, really incredibly laid out in Fanon's works. So I think we have a lot to learn from all these traditions, and it's stupid to just cut off all of these amazing intellectual resources because they're not in English or French, because they got categorized as religious when they were colonized. We miss out on the very things that might be the key to getting us out of this mess.
Oh, thank you. There are some other questions in our queue. One of the, I'm going to just summarize a couple of these. One is just a comment thanking you for wonderful and super generative talk. So many insights here and provocations. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions out of order. One, I think, may have a shorter answer. The other may be a little bit more involved in answering. And I'll ask this one first. Do you think that we create our own nature on an ongoing basis by free will? So this is a question about what might be called human nature. Do you think we create our own nature on an ongoing basis by free will?
Yes, so from the perspective of both Ifa and Sufism, yes, with all of our choices, with all of our acts, we delimit our nature, we can free it up. The distinction being within both of these traditions, our will is not other than the will of the cosmos or the divine will. There's not a hard and fast line between divine will, fate, natural law, and our will. There's not. So yes, through our every choice, we become one possibility and not another. Mm-hmm. Right? I have my hair like this; it's not bald. I'm delimiting myself, and in social terms, we pray facing this way or not that way. There's all of these delimitations that we have on what it means to be human. But these delimitations, what's interesting about these traditions is that they argue that through particular delimitations of this, you can come to realize the complete non-delimitation of this nature, the kind of existence of all possibilities. Even if you don't live out all of those possibilities in your life, you can come to see yourself and see the real in all of these possibilities. So yes, I do think we delimit ourselves with our own free will, but within these traditions, our will is not separate from the divine will or the laws of nature. They're just different perspectives at looking at it. In Sufism, they quote a famous verse of the Quran where it says, "You did not throw when you threw, but God threw."
Okay. Well, thank you. There's another question here. It says, "I think I agree with your critique of Wynter based on the argument that certain West African traditions are cognitively open, especially in critiquing her narrow understanding or use of African examples." But this audience member continues, "But I wonder if there's more to say on the category of autopoiesis and its emphasis on operational closure in the African traditions you highlighted, just as operational closure is highlighted in Wynter's critique of man." So for Maturana and Barella, which of course is Wynter's source for autopoiesis, I think there's a way to read the category where cognitively closed does not necessarily mean closed to conscious self-knowledge of our own knowledge production, but rather closed in the sense of an always present and necessary cognitive blind spot in terms of being able to transcend one's own embodied and therefore limited position of observation. I'm interested in what you might say in terms of foregrounding the limits of embodied perception when this is applied to the African traditions you're highlighting. So could you respond to that?
Yeah, so this is a very good point. So what precisely is going on in the traditions that I'm talking about, both Sufism and in Ifa in particular, is this cognitive, there's a particular cognitive closure, but this closure is meant to not lead to being a blind spot, but it's meant to lead to the elimination of all blind spots. There are accounts of even this in physical terms. So accounts of moments of spiritual realization in Sufi traditions for literally hundreds of years in West Africa, very similar. The people who've gone through them describe it in very similar ways, as being able to see the veins in their body, the veins in the sheep around them, to kind of see everything from every possible perspective. And so what I'm suggesting is we take this kind of metaphorically, and that this cognitive closure, this set of particular embodied practices and rituals that is supposed to lead to kind of the erasure of these closures, that can also translate to the kind of cognitive or meta level of thinking about different orders of knowledge, which you also see, again, written about in Tijani sources with Ibn Arabi as well too, saying that, well, no, I can understand things from these different perspectives. So even in terms of embodied knowledge. I mean, this when we think of our bodies, this is one of the great things about Wynter. Our bodies, according to Wynter, don't precede the cosmologies, the stories that we tell about our bodies. So if you're operating a different cosmology, your body operates different. There are different possibilities. And within the Sufi tradition, you have like 7 different bodies operating on different levels of existence. So the body functions differently and has different possibilities in these different traditions. And the process of initiation and education are meant to bring out these possibilities. Or another way to put it, for Maturana and Varela, the limitation I think there too is they don't take their own seriousness of the kind of narrative nature of biology and apply it to their own story. So if everything's kind of a narrative, then their own story about the brain or the way the eye works or the autopoietic function is itself a narrative. And so what you get with these traditions is, yes, a kind of cognitive closure that excludes certain possibilities initially, but that exclusion is then supposed to lead to a state that opens up onto the realization of all these other possibilities. But this is only possible due to a kind of more expansive cosmology where the body is not just biological material. It includes the biological, but it goes beyond it. Another way to think about this is the senses, work in anthropology on the cultural construction of the senses. You go amongst the Ewe in Ghana, people have different senses. It's not 5 senses, right? People are operating with different senses that they talk about culturally and otherwise. And the same is true within Ifa and Sufism as well too, particularly for initiates. Once you've been initiated and you go through this ritual process of education, your bodily experience of the world and of yourself changes remarkably. You see things that other people don't see, you feel things that other people don't feel, and you experience things that others don't. So again, I would argue, and I think Wynter does too, in some places, against overrepresenting our particular biological conception of embodiment and sensory, overrepresenting it as if that's the way it is for everyone, everywhere, at all times.
Oh, thank you. And we have time for one more question. So this is from another member of our audience. Thanks you for a truly amazing talk. And then they asked, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about how some of the practices of Sufism and Ifa, as you mentioned, work to foster autopoiesis and delimitation. And they continue, I'm thinking in particular about how North and West African Sufis are writing to alter reality through their science of letters.
Yeah, so this science of letters is something that I argue is something that's akin to what Wynter is calling for in this new science of the word. And it's based on this cosmological principle shared pretty much some variations between Ifa and West African Sufism, a doctrine of, you could say, 3 books. So there's the book of the cosmos, that is the world as text, the book of the human soul, and then the book of the kind of sacred text, whether it's the Odu of Ifa or the Quran, or other sacred texts. And the resonances between them allow for writing or recitation of things that change the outward reality of the world and the inward reality of the self. So most Sufi practices typically involve either the vocalized or the silent recitation of certain phrases in Arabic. And these phrases in Arabic are believed to be efficacious in causing all kinds of shifts out there in the world, dynasties to fall, waves to come in, convincing people to go on a date with you, all kinds of different things. And also, and perhaps more importantly, given that within these traditions of Tijani Sufism, the inward world is considered to be even more expansive than the outward world. It contains the whole outward world, changes within the inward world as well too. So reciting these prayers, things in Arabic, and writing them as well too produces profound changes due to this science, this harmony between the 3 books. The book of human language, you could say, the book of the text of the outward world, and the text of the inward self, due to the resonances and harmonies between these, you could say, 3 orders of reality. Changes in one cause changes in the other. And you see this as well in some Orisha traditions of dance as well too. Some of the steps that are taken when you move your body in a certain way, because your body is a kind of microcosm of or macrocosm, depending on how you look at it, moving your body in a certain way causes changes in the whole cosmos. So moving your body moves the body of the world. And a bunch of people doing that together can cause really profound changes, which is why you see at the beginning of a lot of revolutions in the Americas and in the Caribbean, you have rituals where people are dancing together. In order to produce profound changes in the world, you have to produce profound changes in the human beings that make that world. And these profound changes are affected through rituals that usually operate on this logic of symbolism or harmonies between different orders of reality.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank our audience for joining us. Especially want to, again, thank Joe Ford and Dominique Francesca for helping organize this. Professor Oludamini Ogunnaike, thank you so much for agreeing to give our humanities lecture this fall. This has been, as I said, a very generative and just amazing analysis of a rich intersection of materials. Just so our audience knows, we'll be recording a podcast later as well, and so keep a lookout for that. That will be a conversation with Professor Ogunnaike about the work that he's been doing and some of his emerging scholarship. But thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm still thinking through these ideas, so it's very useful for me too.